A veteran, unseen as a soldier, was jailed for stealing bread and an apple. Just a drifter, a minor case, a forgotten file. But when he stepped into the courtroom, the judge flipped through the file, saw that name, and stood up abruptly. The courtroom fell silent. No one understood why, until he said one sentence that stunned everyone into silence. The defendant today once saved my life in Fallujah. This was not just a trial. It was part of the veteran stories society has forgotten. And we, Justice for Veterans, retell it so no one is forgotten twice. His name is Richard Rick Dalton, a Marine Corps sergeant, a survivor of Fallujah. Now, he sleeps under the porch of a small church in Fairhaven, Ohio. Every morning, he wakes early to collect cans and bottles, and divides his meals between himself and an old three-legged dog, his only remaining companion. Rick once had a home, a wife named Mary, an elementary school teacher who loved dogs and hated war. When Mary died of cancer, Rick sold the house and donated all the money to an animal shelter. That was the last thing he could do for her. Since then, he chose to live quietly, unknown to anyone, but still held his back straight, like a soldier who never fell. Winters in Ohio have nights that chill to the bone. Rick curls up under a tattered tarp, holding his dog close, one hand clutching a rusty old medal, the only remnant of his past. He never begs, never pleads for pity, just silently lives, picking cans, eating leftover bread, drinking from public fountains. Sometimes, Rick sits in the park and sees a child drop a glove. He picks it up and runs to return it. No one says thank you. He once led men into battle. Now he is avoided like a plague. PTSD keeps Rick from deep sleep. Every night, phantom bombs echo in his head, but the silence outside is scarier than the gunfire. That night, snow fell thick on the sidewalk. Rick and his dog hadn't eaten for nearly 2 days. His stomach twisted not from hunger but shame. He looked around, then quietly stepped into a small grocery called Nolan's Mart. On the shelf, a still warm loaf of bread. Next to it, a shiny red apple. Rick bowed his head softly. "I'll pay you back, if I survive tonight." He hid the 2 items in his coat, about to leave, when a shout came from behind. "Hey, what are you doing?" A grab, a shove. Rick was thrown onto the cold tile floor. Handcuffs tightened around scarred wrists. Rick Dalton entered the courtroom, his wrists still red from the cuffs. He looked around. Empty seats. No family. No friends. Even his dog was not allowed in. Across the table, a young prosecutor flipped through the file like routine. The defendant has a history of homelessness, food theft, motion to detain. Rick didn't raise his head. His prison shirt hung loose, pants sagged, plastic sandals on his feet. Judge Alan Morris adjusted his glasses and opened the file. A small, unusual object embedded in the paper caught his eye. A silver military ID card, clearly printed. USMC. Fallujah, Skent, Dalton, R. His hand froze. His eyes widened. The whole room froze for a few seconds. Alan Morris stared at the name Dalton, then looked up at Rick. Gray beard, blurred eyes, bent posture. A flash. Memories cut sharply into the present. But the prosecutor kept talking. Motion to detain the defendante, protect the community from repeated offenses. Rick looked up. No anger, no complaint. He only glanced softly toward the window, where he thought his dog waited. His hand clenched lightly. Veins stood out over scars forged by war. Morris swallowed hard, closed the file, and stood up without a word. He left the bench and hurried into his chambers. No one understood what was happening. Judge Alan Morris held the military ID card. Dalton, Richard, Sergeant. He furrowed his brow. His lips barely moved, as if calling back a distant memory. His hand trembled slightly. Fallujah, 2004. A bloody afternoon. A young soldier severely wounded shot in the stomach, unable to move. A strong arm carried him from the rubble, dodging bullets. That soldier's name was Dalton, Rick Dalton. Alan stood abruptly. His face went pale. The courtroom grew confused as the judge hurried into his private chambers, holding the file like a debt unpaid. Red sand, thick smoke, gunfire tearing the sky apart. Fallujah, Iraq, November 2004. A squad of American soldiers fell into an ambush. Blood splattered on broken brick walls. Alan Morris was then only 22, a private. A bullet fragment lodged in his hip. He screamed in despair until a shadow dashed forward through a rain of bullets. Rick Dalton. He said nothing, just hoisted Alan onto his shoulders, crawling meter by meter through the trench. Hold tight, you're not dying today. A shell exploded right behind them, dangerously close, but they lived, because one man never turned his back. Alan stood in his chambers, eyes red, whispering, "I'm alive because of him." In his chambers, Alan Morris removed his judge's robe and began personally reviewing Rick Dalton's entire file. He sifted through old, dusty, crumpled documents filled with medals. Silver Star Medal, 2 Purple Hearts commendation letters from the division commander, but strangely, the VA benefits record stated, terminated due to no fixed address. Alan slammed the papers on the desk. No address. And that's why all support was cut? A man who fought for this country, abandoned by the system just because he wandered? Alan called urgently a veteran legal aid organization. We must fix this. Right now. The courtroom door opened again. Judge Alan Morris walked in, eyes changed. He no longer saw Rick as a defendant, but as an old comrade. Before we proceed, I request absolute silence. A woman entered, simple shirt, carrying a lawyer's briefcase. Julia Hart. I represent Mr. Dalton as a volunteer lawyer from the Veterans Organization. Alan nodded. After reviewing his entire service record and the system's failures, I hereby declare all charges are dismissed. The defendant is innocent. A breath of relief escaped someone's lips. Rick stood still, as if unable to believe it was true. The courtroom doors opened once more. 6 men entered, Marine Corps uniforms, baseball caps in hand. One of them looked at Rick, choked up. Sergeant Dalton, long time no see. Without words, one by one, they stood tall, right hands raised in solemn salute. Rick stood silently. He didn't know what to do, just tried to keep his legs from shaking. His eyes reddened. Scarred hands gripped the edge of the wooden podium. All his life, he never sought glory. But for the first time, he was seen as a human being, as a hero. While the courtroom still remained hushed in reverence, a voice called out from the back. Uncle Rick? Rick turned his head. A young woman, brown hair, tearful eyes, stood in the doorway. Grace Whitmore, his late wife's granddaughter, the child he once held at age 3. I've been looking for you since Aunt Mary passed. Rick opened his mouth. No words came. Grace ran forward, hugging him tightly. Not out of pity, but out of love. In that moment, Rick understood. Though society turned its back, there was still one person who never gave up on him. 1 week later, Rick left the courthouse not in handcuffs, but with an official letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs, full restoration of benefits, reintegration support, and recognition of service. At the Veterans Center, Rick underwent medical checks and PTSD treatment, and the first thing he asked was, "My dog, can he stay with me?" The nurse smiled. "Of course, Sergeant." Rick looked at Grace, who had stayed by his side since the trial ended. "I never thought this day would come, but maybe I'm really still alive." Because for the first time in years, he no longer saw himself as a burden, but as a part of this world. On the day Rick left the reintegration center, a small ceremony was held in the yard. Not formal, no media, just a few veterans, a flag, and the old uniform he wore in Fallujah. Rick put on the jacket, for the first time in nearly 20 years. His back straightened, his gaze no longer lost. A young officer approached and saluted. "Welcome back, Sergeant Dalton." Everyone stood silently, saluting him, not for rank, but because he reminded them of loyalty, sacrifice, and honor. Rick smiled, looking into the distance. "I'm still alive, and I'm still a soldier." Rick Dalton is more than a story. He is a reminder. Justice is not just on paper. It lives in how we see a human being. A loaf of bread is not worth taking someone to court, but silence before sacrifice is enough to bring society into question. How many like Rick are out there, who fought, lost, then were forgotten, just because they stayed silent and because we never asked? Justice for veterans does not tell stories to evoke pity. We tell them to remind. A nation that does not honor its soldiers is a nation losing its soul. If you believe they deserve to be remembered, leave the word justice below the video and share, so no one has to stand alone in silence like Rick once did.